Hello, everyone. This is John Voyevoda, and welcome to the Passion for Creative Writing podcast. Today, we're talking with American author Paul Miller, whose book, Ghost Puncher, is...
Albrecht drew Ghost Puncher.
Albrecht, yeah, and Albrecht. Yeah. Sorry about that.
No problem.
It's available right now on Amazon, and I am going to be providing a link to that underneath the podcast here. And so we were just talking about... I was asking you, do you consider yourself a Paul Miller, a writer from Texas? You said I'm a writer from America, but you were saying that you've basically lived all over the United States. And
my dad was in the Army, so growing up, we moved every 2 to 3 years regardless. And I ended up going from Hawaii to Boston for my first ill-fated attempt at college. And I never really lost the wanderlust. I figured that if I ever wanted to be an author, capital A, big time author, I needed to see as much of the country and the world as I could before I, got too old to keep going. So I did.
And now you're in Alabama.
Yeah, long, strange string of circumstances got me down here.
Whereabouts in Alabama?
Huntsville.
Huntsville, Alabama.
It's the northern part. It's pretty... big tech town now. It's been growing a lot in the 10 years I've been here. And it just seems that I ended up preceding the rush down here. I was living in D.C. before I moved here, and it seems like every other car that I see has a Virginia, D.C., or Maryland license plate, as a lot of tech folks move down here.
Interesting. And how many people live there, approximately?
When I got here, I think the Tennessee Valley, which is where we're located, the greater Huntsville. If you took everybody and added them together, it was about 300,000.
And so, Paul, is this your first novel?
This is the only existing novel, the only existing first novel. My first novel, I wrote at 19, and a good buddy of mine left the manuscript in a cab in D.C.
Oh, D.C. Okay, yeah, and so you wanted to do a bit of a reading from it, and I would really be interested in hearing that. Do you feel ready to do that now?
Yeah, I think we could do that. If you could forgive, I quit smoking 2 years ago when my daughter was born, and the damage is still in the throat and lungs. So if it's
no worries.
All right, this is going to be from chapter 4, verse 7 of Albrecht drew Ghost Puncher. He walked, cloaked in a blue razor vortex of invectives and incoherence, aimless and looking to incite. What he wanted to incite he didn't know and didn't care. All he knew was that he was tired and the fun part of his booze had worn off, and all he cared about was not going home. He walked through streets devoid of light, unpopulated, vacant but for the rats and the dogs and the forgotten men who had no shelter from the rain that came down like pine needles in a wildfire. The sudden cold dug into him, clattered his jaws, stung his broken nose, clung to him like unfinished sex. It had been hours since Al lost track of the wino or even recognized the streets to which he stumbled, almost as long since he'd had to shove past another body or had some sleep-interrupted citizen shout at him from a slammed-open window. The farther away from the Cyclops he got, the darker the night grew, the harder the rain and the recrimination fell. Townhouses and boutique storefronts gave way to tenements and boarded windows. Cramped, overgrown lots teemed with coyotes and carrion feeders, and shadows found deeper places to hide from whatever moonlight dared venture earthward. Dimly, distracted by the fact that he'd been kicking the crap out of a stray garbage can for the last few minutes, Al realized he'd just crossed Martin Luther King Boulevard. Just to be sure, he checked himself. He hadn't been shot yet. Jennings Heights crowded all around him. One condemned building holding up the next, all of them waiting for the rogue gust of wind that would bring the whole ghetto down. Cars hunkered in the downpour, rusting and abandoned where they'd been stripped years or minutes before. Some of them had people inside, others maybe corpses. Al didn't look too closely. A skinny, destitute hooker spied him from a doorway, offering her wretched wares with a series of gestures more ridiculous than seductive. Al didn't acknowledge her, but saw her give him the finger as he trudged past. She disappeared an instant later, and Al knew she'd gone off to tell someone what she'd seen wandering around the hood. He didn't belong here, and the locals would have no qualms about reminding him of that. He had to get out of there, but the storm had grown into a deluge, getting stronger every second. He'd meant to lose himself tonight, and he had. Hours of turning down random alleys and blindly loping off after anything that caught his eye had stolen all sense of space and direction. There was no way he could find his way back home in the dark. He'd be lucky if he could get out of Jennings Heights without getting rolled. If it weren't for the rain, whoever the hooker had run off to tell about him likely would have already done the honors. But a little rain never dissuaded a pimp for long. The thought did a fine job of sobering Al a little bit, and he began to move a little faster. He needed to get off the street, out of sight, find a place to hide. Al ducked down an alley, desperate to elude whoever was or wasn't chasing him. The general slanting dilapidation of the buildings offered a little cover from the rain, and Al found he wasn't the only one taking advantage. "Hello, children," Al said like Chef from South Park, waving to the three kids huddled beside an overflowing dumpster. He couldn't tell if they were boys or girls, thanks to the deplorable state of their clothes and hygiene, but they were short and probably not yet teenagers, which was a good thing because the only people worse than teenagers were adults and preschoolers. They might have been midgets. Don't mind me, just trying to get away from an army of killer pimps. And that leads into the more pivotal and exciting moments of the book. But I think I just wanted to give a sense of the aloneness of Al as he goes through this story.
So thank you very much for doing that reading. Just to give like a bit of a background of the novel now, it's about a person who can punch ghosts.
Yeah, that's pretty much the basic wind it down and let it go premise of the book. Is you've got this guy, he's washed up, he's a drunk, he's got just enough of the fighter left in him that he might be able to do something, but his life is going nowhere. And on one night, he kind of loses everything that matters to him and ends up getting, jumped by the ghost of a Jive Turkey 70s pimp.
That's right. I was going to mention that. Jive Turkey 70s pimp.
Yeah.
That's
and after
fabulous.
that, things get weird.
Okay. And so now there's set. When I look at the character's name, it reminds me of Albrecht Rai. Is there any connection there between the Renaissance painter?
Now, there's something in that, I'll never pronounce it Albrecht. You say Jura. I've always said Dur because I'm an American, and if we don't like things that are hard to pronounce, we just pronounce them however we want. Mm-hmm. But the man dealt with devils, and he dealt with darkness, and I think that was playing in my mind when Al told me his name. I think that there is a definite connection there, if it's never stated directly in this book.
And so you said when he introduced himself, so the connection you have with this character, how did that develop?
Well, there's more than a little bit of me in Al, and more than a little bit of Al in me. It's just, and one day I was sitting in my house, or in my dad's house, really, having a meeting with my old buddy Jim Beam. I was watching Ghost Hunters or Ghost Adventures or one of those shows on the History Channel, and it got me thinking, what would I do if a ghost showed up in my house right now? And a voice that wasn't really mine popped in and said, well, I don't know what you'd do, but I'd punch the crap out of it. And I giggled and had another couple of shots, and the idea of this guy, this just burnt out fighter who was never going to let go of that bottle, and it was never going to beat him, just sort of came rushing through me. And the story, it was down on yellow legal pads 5 minutes later, and it started evolving from there just all at once.
And in your blurb, you talk about how you were growing up in Austin, or you mention Austin, and then you say before it went weird. And I might be out of that loop. I'm curious what you meant by that.
Well, Austin, Texas, it is the capital of Texas, and it is probably the bluest dot in the whole state. You know, in terms, we have our red states and our blue states, our Republican right wing and our, you know, blue Democrat left wing, and you know, I don't play into that system. I don't believe in red or blue. I believe in whatever I personally believe is going to direct how I engage in democracy. But for being the most Republican red state, the capital city is a blue dot. And I was born there, and sometime after I was born, they adopted the slogan, "Keep Austin Weird." Because it seems that with the University of Texas, Austin, being there too, it has attracted the most free-thinking and progressively minded people. So I think that happened like right after I was born and right after I moved away.
How old were you when you moved away?
2 weeks, I think.
2 weeks. Okay. So you didn't grow up there?
I grew up, I lived in Beeville, Texas for the first 5 years, which, you know, I'm not exactly even sure where that is in terms of in Texas. I just knew that it wasn't that far from the Gulf Coast. But then after that, the family went up to Boston. So I had the pleasure of being a Bruins fan for about 3 years and then completely forgetting that hockey existed. We went from Boston to Kansas back to San Antonio, Texas, which by then Austin had decided it was weird. From San Antonio, it was to Southern Virginia, near Norfolk, which, again, another place I'll never pronounce like the locals. But then after that, my high school years were spent in Honolulu, Hawaii.
Nice.
And that was a fantastic thing that I just did not know how to take advantage of. I was too much of a contrarian loner, you know, asshole to really take advantage of living in Hawaii. But it's probably the greatest place just in terms of sheer paradisical joy that can be experienced that I've ever been to. But then it was off to Boston, D.C., Seattle, little stop in Provo, Utah, and then back to D.C. and then again, strange circumstances ended up with me in Alabama. So here I am.
And what were some of the writers that influenced you?
Well, I think you have to go. The first writer that really influenced me was Chris Claremont. He wrote the longest run of Marvel's X-Men from, you know, the late 70s through the 80s. And that was the thing that got me reading. And then it was, you know, J.R.R. Tolkien when I decided that I couldn't afford comics and I needed to go to the library and get books. And then after that, you know, Gary Gygax or again, pronunciations elude me. Don't even try to get me to pronounce your name until you say it at least 3 more times. And then, you know, everybody who wrote fantasy for TSR and Dungeons and Dragons. But then when I got into my teens, it was Charles Bukowski, William Burroughs, Jack Kerouac, the other Beats, Anne Rice, of course, you know, Stephen King and Chuck Palahniuk, and just whatever I could get my hands on in terms of, you know, the fiction. And then as far as other authors that influenced me, there's, you know, probably the biggest influence in terms of my nonfiction taste was Hunter S. Thompson, just because he showed me that it is the writer and not necessarily the writing, but at the same time, it's definitely the writing and not the writer that can be inspirational. But really, my biggest influences, you know, they come from the TV and the movie screens. I mean, I've always tried to, my writing voice is trying to evoke Tarantino and Rodriguez and, you know, Capra, as much as it's trying to invoke any of the authors that I've ever had the pleasure of reading. And, you know, I say all these author names, and I don't even mention Paulo Coelho, who is the one guiding star in terms of, you know, books that, authors that keep me reading and writing.
And I'm kind of surprised to hear when you say Capra, you mean the director, right?
Oh yeah.
Like
I don't know why his name popped out. I mean, I think I was thinking It's a Wonderful Life.
Right. It's kind of sticks out there, and I'm just wondering, is there an element of that in your book?
I think there is, because it's redemption and self-worth, and recognizing the value that you might be bringing to the world without realizing it. And there is a definite element of that in Albrecht Rai.
And so he's a hero.
That's a question. He's a guy trying to live his life and do what comes naturally to him. And he's, of course, trying to find a way to turn what he's good at into something more than just getting by. There's an earlier passage in the book where, ballroom brawler and ballroom philosopher Al is talking to his buddy, who's basically in the process of just betraying him in the most brutal way possible. But Al begins to talk about the universal locomotive and how, the universe acts as this train where you get on at your stop and you get off. And every moment in between, you are exactly where you're supposed to be. And so circumstance may at one point later on in the series put Al in a place where he is supposed to be there and play the role of the hero. But I don't think he's ever thought about it long enough to determine whether or not he is a hero. Certainly the things he's done in his past would prevent him ever using the term for himself. But that's all more stuff that gets developed later on in the series.
And when you say series, is this the first of a serialized series of books?
It is.
Okay.
There is. I have had 5 books on Albrecht Rai finished and in the can since I think early 2017. And because I didn't want to. We were dealing with it back then. I didn't want to have my story untold because I got discouraged somewhere along in the line of looking for publishers. So I wanted to make sure it was written and done before I ever had a chance to give up on it. You know what I mean?
Never give up on anything ever.
Well, that's a. I don't think the things that you could give up on. I don't think they let you give up after a while, but it can be hard not giving up on stuff.
It's definitely hard, yeah. It's just one of my favorite quotes. It's Winston Churchill, and I've got a Polish background, and my father was...
I wouldn't have guessed by the name.
But my father was, in the British Army, and the whole story of Poland, never give up, man, on anything ever, never. Well,
when geography does to you what it did to Poland, you can't ever give up.
No. Yeah, never give up, ever. And that, that's what I like about, Ultimate Fighting as well. I love to see people get up off the mat and continue with the fight, so I would encourage you also to never give up on your writing. And I know that you haven't, because you've obviously published this. And I'm just wondering, how did you contact Charlie Franco from Montag?
Well, I spent the better part of 2 years contacting, I think, what ended up being every single agent working in the industry who was willing to look at unsolicited queries.
Mm-hmm.
And after 2 years of getting close a couple of times, I said, you know what? Screw this. If I can't find somebody to do it, I'm going to do it myself.
Mm-hmm.
But before I do that, I'm going to find a list of 10 publishers willing to look at unsolicited manuscripts or at least queries. And I fired off 9 emails. And to tell you the truth, by that time I was kind of pissed. So I heard this slogan, books worth burning. And that's Charlie Franco's Montag Press. And I said, you know what? There has never been a book more deserving of being burned for offending, pissing off, or otherwise aggressively engaging its audience. So I hammered out an email that just basically said, you know what? I'm not even going to give you the story. I'm just going to tell you that Albrecht Drew is a guy who kicks in the door, pisses on the wall, and sets fire to your living room, but in literary form. Okay. And, just didn't hear anything for a few months, but wanted to send out one more email that said, hey, man, are you interested? Because I'm going to self-publish this if nobody wants it. And he said, oh, my God, it's still available? Good. And send it to us right away.
Nice.
And he has been my biggest supporter since. I mean, from what I understand, it was a question as to whether or not other members of the collective wanted to invest the amount of time it would take to do the 5 books. And Charlie went to bat, and he asked me if it was a deal breaker, if they only wanted to commit to the first one. And I said, oh, hell no, it's not a deal breaker. I'm beginning to think that if I had not mentioned the other 4 books, I'd have had a lot more success a lot sooner.
Interesting.
I just found it. I found Montag on a list of folks who look at things without an agent. So that's the big meet cute there.
And so, Paul, I'm just curious, like you're saying that Albrecht Rai, that he's stirring things up, is that his kind of modus operandi to do that, or where is he coming from?
He comes from an old place, really. I think it's the Bukowski and the Sam Spade, the old school Wolverine of guys who, they're not instigators, but there is a certain, before the word had been forever attached to toxic, a certain masculinity and a certain just raw-knuckled truthfulness, a open honesty to who he is and where he comes from, in terms that he doesn't soften his words, but he's not going out of his way to force them on you. He's a guy who does things his way, and just I think when you do things your way, without polishing them and without prettifying them and without making them fit what has become the contemporary idea that anytime you offend anyone, you are instantly a bad person, or you are flagged as untouchable. You become a pariah for voicing anything that doesn't fit the contemporary culture in America. And obviously things weren't like that necessarily when I wrote the books, because it's been, I started writing it in 2014, but he is kind of an ideal of that whole, the cowboy, the paladin, the knight in shining armor, that armor doesn't shine anymore. Or we're in a period when, being an offensive, straight talker is going to get you in trouble. I
really like the sort of the archetype of the cowboy. Yeah. I find it really interesting, and I also it's something that I instantly kind of associate with Texas. I don't know if that's a fair thing. Would you say it is, or it isn't?
It is definitely, if Japan has ninja and England has knights in armor, then Texas has a cowboy. Mm-hmm. And Canada has hockey players, although they really should be replaced by Wayne from Letterkenny at this point, because that's what the world is seeing now. But it is a definitely Texan thing, and I think everybody in the world has that association.
Yeah, and it's so iconic, and it means a lot. And when you originally were saying you're from Texas, and that's why I wanted to, at the beginning I was saying, is that, could we say that you're a writer from Texas? But You're a writer from America. By the way, are you familiar with Charlie Crockett, the country singer from Texas?
No, I'm not.
I'm going to send you a link. You're going to love this guy. But and I'm more than willing to give him a shout out here on the podcast because he's amazing. But you're going to like him, I think. But and so it sounds a bit like maybe he's a displaced cowboy, Albrecht Rai.
It's something about the loner and about the, a person who can fend for himself, but maybe isn't as polished or as ready to show off to, society. And that's a deeply ingrained part of what it means to be an American for me. Sorry about that.
No worries. And
I think a lot of other people too. It's just the lone, not even a lone gunman. It could be the lone doctor, the lone person who ventures into the wilderness to protect. Because that's what cowboys did. They protected the cows on their way to, the slaughterhouse. But they were there to ensure the safety of the herd. And whether they did that just by sitting in the saddle all day or by running off, marauding hordes of coyotes, wolves, or angry natives, that's what they did. They protected. And that is who Al is. And I think that's who America wants to be, is the protector, the hero.
And so there's this idea of the outlaw, or if you will, the enlightened criminal. And I believe that's language that you use in your blurb.
Oh, yeah.
And I want you to talk a bit more about that. Can you expand on that idea a bit? Like, what's the enlightened criminal?
Well, and there are a lot of people in America who are going to get pissed if I say something like this, but the truth is, we are a nation of criminals. We are smugglers. We started off as slavers, and thank God we got rid of that, but it took some doing. But our entire country was basically started by people who did not want to follow the laws and the rules put down by Western Europe and its churches. So we came over here and we said we're far enough away from the long arm of the law that we can fight a war and not have to pay attention to that law anymore. And we were founded on these crazy ideas that you can have a nation built on logic and reason and what were the ideals of enlightenment. And from that, we've just kind of kept going. The most successful Americans have always been the ones who have avoided the law without necessarily committing acts of evil. We take pride in our Dillingers and in our robber barons that, history eventually proves monsters. But while we're doing it, we're just trying to get by on our pluck and hopefully create a place where progressive ideals can flourish. Even if a lot of people try to keep them from doing so, we still have a place where they can at least be shared.
Very interesting. And so, Paul, you say that the series is already written?
Oh, yeah.
Already written.
It's been sitting there for a while. And I think there's been some interest shown at Montag about getting the whole thing out there, but we're going to give it a little time to, let the first book, create a platform for the rest of them.
And what's your writing process? Do you write by hand, or do you write straight into the computer, or how do you do that?
It's changing now. I used to, when I first started writing anything back in the 80s and 90s, a computer was not a thing that you had access to, or at least not me. So I would always write on yellow legal pads, and every time I write out a new draft or a new outline or any of that, it goes on the paper, and transferring it to other papers is a process of refinement. But since I finished Albrecht Rai, I've gotten to be a bit older, and some of my past has caught up with me, and I have such a hard time seeing the paper and reading my own handwriting. I've begun to just start doing a treatment on the computer, and then, you know, kind of dig an outline out of that and kind of break it down into small sections, and just get it all out at once, and then refine it, and it, you know, adding things like, you know, descriptions and characters and dialogue slowly gets done as the file gets closed, printed, and then rebuilt on the computer.
And
to be honest,
sorry, go ahead.
I have a 22-month-old little girl that keeps me from doing a whole lot of anything.
Yeah, well, she's still really young. I guess it'll get easier. And so congratulations.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, she's sleeping right now, but she won't be for long.
Yeah, I hear her in the background. And is the series continuing? Are you continuing to write more on this character? Or is it done?
I don't want to give away the ending, and but I'll say that the world, the city of Bitburg and the world that it lives in, you know, like they say, there's a million stories to tell.
Yeah.
And by the end of it, there are so many things that have changed, and so many new worlds that have been created that I have written and will continue to write more stories set in that world.
Okay, well, that's interesting. And so, Paul, I think we've come to our time, and I really appreciate you meeting with me. And
hey, it was my pleasure, man.
And like I said, I am going to be including a link to the Amazon page for your book.
Awesome.
And it's been a pleasure. And you know, thank you very much. And you have
thank you. This is this is my first time giving an interview, and I'm sure I talk too much and too fast.
No.
But, you know, anytime you want me back, I'd be happy to talk to you again.
I will have you back, and everyone should definitely check out the link. And so Paul Miller, and the book is Albrecht Rai, Ghost Puncher.
Yes.
So thank you very much. You have a great day.